Greetings worldwide. This is Jim Signer, and I have my esteemed colleague Dan Morris with me. And what we want to do today is give you an overview of two brand new books that we're both very excited about. And they're books that actually work together. Dan and I have worked in the past, and independently we worked on some books, and it turns out, lo and behold, they were in sync. So I'm going to tell you first about mine, and then I'm going to pass control to Dan, and Dan's going to tell you about his book. So the name of my book is Digital Transformation, A Brief Guide for Game Changers. And basically, the subtitle is Innovate or Die Slowly. So we all know that we're facing digital transformation either sooner or later. Sooner if you're dealing with an upstart in your industry, and then later incrementally, potentially for those that are not facing the upstart. So let me tell you a little bit about the authors. Well, I need control back of the slide.
You should have control if you try moving the mouse. There you go.
There we go. Now I got it. Thank you. Let me tell you a little bit about the authors. Basically, we're saying any book is as good as the authors, we think. Myself, I now work as a fellow for Aragon. I also simultaneously part-time run an art studio. I was involved with defining the hype cycle and the maturity models, first ones for Gartner. I worked as a practitioner longer than I care to admit in several multinational organizations. I led the BPM practice at Gartner, authored, this is my third book. I have a blog that's attracting about 20,000 hits a month. I've spoken on every continent. Actually, I shouldn't admit how old I am, but I've run a number of guide share projects. My co-author is Peter Fingar, who is world-renowned for, BPM, the third wave, and a number of other books, including Extreme Competition and Cognitive Computing. So he's had a number of great books. He's a practitioner even longer than me, and he's done that worldwide, and he's led a number of international projects. So Peter was kind of my associate on this, and added the glue to make it work and the introductions, etc. So this book is a really interesting approach. This is Peter Fingar's approach, is the notion of a game changer. If you take a look at the quote at the top and under why the book is needed, Harvard Business School survey said looked at 1,000 professionals, and 94% of them worked 50 hours a week, and almost half worked more than 65. I'm in that half. And this book is, 75 pages. So on a 3-hour plane ride, you can at least digest it. So we call it a little book on digital transformation that can be digested, but deep enough to offer further study and actions. And it acts as, in essence, a hub, because it points to other videos, other content, other authors. And the digital impact is going to get everybody, whether it's an individual or a company, and then some will have to transform faster than others. We found that there was no real comprehensive and concise book on digital transformation. There's some great books out there, but they're thick. And I don't know about you, but I sure don't have time to dig through 350 pages to get it netted out. So this also is a rare approach in that it balances theory with experience-based practicality. I've worked on other transformations in big companies, consolidating systems, model-driven solutions for a multinational company that had core processes and applications with local variations worldwide. And frankly, the experience levels aren't often adequate to the challenges of digital transformation. We found that out on some of our early transformation projects in the 90s and the 2000s, that we were learning on the fly. And so I've tried to incorporate some of these lessons. It's not a project management issue, it's a shift in attitude, strategy, tactics, and operations. So here's some reviews. We've gotten some reviews by people from Google, Tom Davenport from an analytic perspective, to Richard Welke, who's renowned for methodology, Nathaniel Palmer, a big BPM guru, and so you can see that there's some significant people, and by the way, there's probably another 20 that have given us nice reviews. We're pretty happy about that. And the content, it has three major sections. The first is about why and how organizations need to think. So in other words, this gives you the reason, why do I want to even attempt something risky like a transformation, much less a digital transformation. It puts some numbers behind it. And the numbers were from a MIT study, and consulting in some other consulting organizations to say, which industries are the hottest, which ones have, very little time to react with a big impact, and it's somewhat of a matrix, and that's involved there. And we actually go through the three approaches to digital transformation. One is turnkey, which I have a hard time believing in it because I've seen lots of turnkey approaches fail. They have to be very, very well planned. And then incremental transformation, and then speed incremental transformation, where you use, in essence, a Agile approach, where you use structure where it makes sense, and you do iterative learning. The second section talks about the major thrusts of digital. One is the outside-in customer-focused efforts, which generally happen early in the transformation process. The second is operational improvements. And these things don't necessarily happen in sequence. So sometimes in order to get the money to do the customer-focused efforts, you have to do some operational improvements, use those improvement funds, in essence, as a capital fund. And in other words, you're being your own VC. And then the third is innovation, product, and service creation. Now, there's a fourth that may or may not happen, and that is a change in the business model. So, for instance, if you get very successful with a new product and service, you may change your whole business model. Those taxi companies that have been invaded by Uber have had to change their business models. So hopefully you're not in an industry where you're getting an upstart, putting pressure on you, and maybe you're trying to get ahead of that because it's going to happen sooner or later. And then the third section, which is my favorite section, is look at the best practices and what experience-based advice that came from multiple large-scale transformation and some partial digital journeys. So, digital is not something that happens overnight. Some of it's longer term. So we've got some case studies that are partial digital journeys and some case studies that are full digital journeys. Well, it's really hard to know when you're done, frankly, but as full as they thought they'd get. So here's the table of contents, abbreviated. The first one is shift happens. Notice the close spelling to another word. And it talks about why it takes the risk, what does it mean to transform, how do you deal with a customer interactions taking an outside-in view, how do you get smarter business operations, and how do you do innovative services. The second section of that is the kinds of approaches, big bang incremental, speed incremental. establishing the shared activities for all digital transformations. There are 3 approaches, but there are a lot of shared activities across them. And how to establish milestone scenarios and tipping points in transformation. I don't know if you've ever been through a big transformation, but everybody fights it to a certain point, and then it shows some success, and then everybody wants it. That's that tipping point. And how do you go digital with legacy? That's one of the questions that people have. I've got this legacy stuff, what do I do with it? And there's some good practical suggestions there. And then the learn by example with case studies. So you can see the Aragon logo here on the right. At this point in time, I'd like to thank you. Digital transformation is available on Amazon. All you have to do is look up my last name, Sinur, S-I-N-U-R, and you can buy it in paperback or you can buy it in a Kindle version. Both are reasonably priced, and I like to describe it as condensed soup. You have to add some little bit of your own water, but it's awfully tasty. The other book that I wrote is the Business Process Management, The Next Wave. It has some even more advanced things that digital even hasn't embraced yet, the notion of swarming agents and the idea of bots doing things for you. That's a little heavy, and that requires some cognitive computing, and you'll see another book by Peter Fingar that I was involved with a little bit. Been involved with a number of different books for WFMC, where I've written chapters and stuff. I wrote one on how knowledge workers will become the superheroes of the digital age. So at this point in time, I'd like to thank you for your time, and I'd like to turn it over to Dan. And if we could pass control to Dan so he could manage the slides, that would be terrific.
Thank you, Jim. Okay. As Jim mentioned, Jim and I have worked together and collaborated together and kind of bounced new ideas off of one another for several years now. And I've always found Jim to be a pretty advanced thinker in the types of things he's involved with and the types of things he's been doing. And I think that partially is because of his role at Gartner, but it's certainly helpful. And I think you'll find a lot of interesting material in his books. But once you identify the direction, you have an idea of what you want to do, you now have to do it. And the Business Transformation Field Guide is a book. It's a how-to book that'll help you start to actually implement the types of things that Jim has been talking about in his books. Now, the field guide was written by 3 people, and I'll take just a second to run through some of those things because, as Jim says, any book is really just as good as the people who write it. And by that I mean their experience, their understanding, and their background. And first of all, myself, some of you may know me from this webinar series and from other things dealing with ABPMP. But for those of you who may not know who I am or what I've done, I'm on the ABPMP International Board. I led the version 3 of the CBOC rewrite, and I also am a major contributor to the CBPA and the CBPP certification tests. I've been involved in this, and I'm admitting my age, but I've been involved in this since the mid-1990s, and before that, for some time as a CIO and other things on the IT side. But in the 2000s, I became the North American Practice Director for Business Process Excellence for 3 major international consulting firms. I've now written 5 books. Also a PEX columnist for those that may want to take a look at some of my columns. I'm an international speaker and a former member of the Forrester BPM Council. And then also, Jim mentioned, and we'll talk a little bit about it, but Jim mentioned the term WAGIL. And we put together a methodology that's based on that concept, which is leveraging the best parts of Agile and waterfall methodologies. And we find that in business transformation, neither one of those approaches in of itself will get you where you want to go. They're both good. They both have great components, but they also have some significant failings. But when we find when you put them together, you now have something that is really tailor-made for business transformation and the types of things that we're moving into now with the whole BPMS-enabled BPM movement. Other authors, we have Rod Moyer, who's written several PEX columns. He was a principal consultant with Infosys, senior manager at EY, and he's led a variety of projects in different industries from BPM. Keith Lust, who his claim to fame is really, he headed the Six Sigma Institute, I think it was, at Motorola, the Motorola Training Institute. So he was the guy who led that Six Sigma effort at Motorola, at least the training side of it. As you can see, he's been the author of several different articles and columns, and he was also head of business transformation at Prudential and Oracle. He's been involved in Oracle and then at Accenture. What that does is it means that we've roamed around a lot. We're kind of the old brigade, and we stepped on a lot of landmines, and we know a lot about what makes things fail, and hopefully a little bit about what makes things succeed. So moving on, it's that whole what makes things fail and what makes things succeed perspective that caused us really to write this book. We've been involved in business transformation since its early days, and I personally got involved in it in the mid-1990s. And there we were dealing with knowledge, where we're dealing with a lot of things with Tarkington that turned into ultimately TIBCO, I believe. But we were looking at, in the early days, how you could really drive business transformation from the business side, because there was this big gulf that we still have, but there's a big gulf between IT and the business people. And we found that that big gulf really created a lot of problems. So there's been a lot of activity, a lot of effort looking at how can you get around that, and what types of methods do you need, what types of things will help you move through that. And that caused us to look at what do we need to do in order to help essentially mentor teams and how to succeed in business process and business transformation development projects. And over the years, this has been kind of a focus of mine, looking at what makes projects fail so that the teams that I had and the projects that we were involved in could succeed or had a higher probability of success. And we've led, I've been involved in transformation projects of all sizes. And I've sat in on officers' meetings where the interesting thing that happened quite a few times was that the IT people would deliver something with the BPMS that they're very proud of, only to have the business vice presidents say, I don't know what you're talking about. Pull this thing out. It's worse than what we had. It's killing us. Get rid of it. And so we're starting to see that chasm again between what the business wants and what the IT side thinks the business wants. And so we need to figure out a way to eliminate that and get past that. Now, the book was written to provide both the broad and deep background that we find is necessary in order to help bring all that together. We had to get past the business guys, the tech guys, and the business architects and the enterprise architects and all that type of thing, So one of the things that you'll see in the book is a move to collaboration, a move to bringing all these components together so that you have the disciplines that you need to apply when you need them, and we talk about that in the book, and that you have the skills that are necessary at given points in time so you can apply them properly. And through methodology, you have the control that you need from those different disciplines to pull them together so you now have an integrated new way of approaching business transformation projects. Okay, let me move to the next slide. There we go. Now, today, I've read several reports that were disappointing. The reports were talking about failure rates in BPM, BPMS projects that are as high as 70%. One report said 80%, but you know, we can believe what we want. I personally don't think they're this high, except you have to look at the way they define it. When you define it as either over time, over budget, cutting some of the features, functionality of it, or essentially dumbing down the features and functions that are delivered, then you can start to understand what goes into that 70%. Because the 70% I don't look at as a failure rate as much as a disappointment rate. So we looked at, looking at what causes that, what's really the underlying issues. Of course, you have the same things that we've always dealt with, which deal with, there's oftentimes a lack of executive commitment, and that's either in resources or people or money. There's often a total misunderstanding of what this is all about when they talk to some business people or they talk to the tech people. One of the things that we find in ABPMP is that if you have 10 people, practitioners in a room, and you ask them all to write down what BPM is, you'll get at least 8 different answers. And it's pretty much the same thing with all that we're talking about, and that's one of the reasons that we stress collaboration, is to pull that all together. And that gets us down to standards, techniques, policies, and we find that when we look at different companies and how do you control this thing? How do you really deal with it? Well, see, we follow Agile. I said, well, what does that mean to you? And how does that relate to the business? And you start to get all of these blank stares, because the fact is it's really not well controlled and it's really not well managed from the standpoint that every manager, they may be PMP certified, but that tells you how to manage a project. It doesn't tell you what activities you need to perform in a given type of a project. And what we found is that business transformation projects are really pretty complex. They're a lot more robust, a lot more complex than, we'll say, the more simplistic continuous improvement projects, which are making something that's already in place better. Instead, with a transformation project, you're asking the fundamental questions. Why do we need to do this? What does it need to be? How does it support strategy? Where is this going? And then start to build out from there. So it's a much more robust type of experience, but it's one that you need a lot of different input, insight into. And move down to the next slide. And we also, one of the things that we did with the book, and our reason for doing this was we wanted to vet it, we wanted to make sure that it was A, understandable, and B, not outlandish. And we sent it out to multiple people, and they were nice enough to give us reviews of the book. And fortunately, the reviews all came back pretty good. And we were real happy with what they were saying. We found that there's a pretty basic need for this type of support, because even within a given team, there are a lot of different ways that people start to try to do things. And one of the things that we needed to do was to bring everybody onto the same page so that they had a common understanding of what to do, when to do it, why it's being done, and how to do it. And we see that reflected in some of these some of these statements as far as recommendations are concerned. And I won't bore you by reading them, but we were pretty happy with them, pretty proud of the book. Now, one of the themes that comes through continuously is a need to expand competencies. And we find that this is one of the things through ABPMP that we found is, especially when we started to look at certification, we laid out the different competencies, like in the ABPMP competency model. We laid out the different competencies that one would need and the level of skill in those competencies based on essentially beginners through to architects through to the executives. And in doing that, we find that people often have very deep but very focused skills. And they don't have the skills that they would often need across the entire business transformation project. As an example, where you have at the front end, how do you want to tie into strategy? How do you want to make sure it's going where it needs to go with business architecture? That moving over with a new business model and that new conceptual design to say, okay, how do I want this thing to really operate? And how do we want this to really operate with process architects moving in and dealing with enterprise architects to pull that together? And all of those things really tend to be more narrowly focused. Just as the continuum from once you redesign it, you do that with business BPM and business transformation, you then move into the realm of continuous improvement. And how does that all fit together? So what we tried to do in the book was to provide what we call hints. And those hints are really best practice suggestions, what to do, what not to do, organized through essentially the framework of our methodology. Although we don't really lay out the methodology, we just talk about those things that need to be done. So what we're trying to do is to expand that skill set, to give people an understanding of what they would do outside of areas that they're personally experienced in and comfortable in. Okay. So the goal of the book is to provide a type of mentoring to project teams and really to put everybody on the same page, able to do things in the same way. We also, because the book is a little heavy, we didn't want to have a book where people had to read it from the front to the back. And then after you go through it once, you can't find anything again easily as a reference. So we built it so that you could get into it and out of it very fast. You can look up hints on what you're doing or what you're about to do, and then get out of it. So it's an in-out type of a book from a structural standpoint. Again, the structure is the framework of our ADDIE methodology, which, as a note, by the way, is the only methodology that really supports WAGIL. And it supports IBPM, and these concepts are all built into these into the hints that we're going to be talking about. But it covers the full life cycle of a BPM and a BPMS supported BPM project. There are over 840 best practice hints divided into those 7 sections of the methodology. And those then are divided into activity groups, so that if you're going to do, say, you're going to do future state analysis, you have a group of hints in there. If you're going to do future state modeling, you have the hints in there. If you're going to do rules, you have the hints in there. So each thing that you're going to do, we've organized the hints into groupings that will allow you to get in, look at best practices based on experience, and the things that we know work, and warning you of things that we know don't work. And then, again, building that in a way that's easy to absorb and each of the sections that we have, because so you have the main 7 sections and then subsections under those. But each of those subsections will have an introduction that gives you a basic foundation for what's going on in that subsection, and then give you kind of a framework for how those hints will come together and fit in. Okay, and the table of contents, you'll see it builds from the very front end, where you start to look at building teams, working with people, putting project plans together, doing that type of thing, looking at, and throughout this there's collaboration. For example, when you start to prepare for the project, who's going to be involved in it? What are the skills that you're going to need? What are the components of the methodologies that you're going to need? In some cases you'll deal with business architecture, in some cases you won't. In some cases you may be more heavily focused on the technology side because you want to bring that social media, that whatever type of technology that you're dealing with, you want to bring that in and start to leverage it. So each project's a little bit different, but you have to pull together collaboratively what that project group is going to be. And then you have to look at orchestration, saying, when do I need these skills? How do I need to apply them? And then how do I need this thing all to fit together so I can start to move through this? Pulling that all together and doing, essentially looking at change management, looking at project setup, is in the setup, we then move through the current state to the future state. And that's all, by the way, ABPM focused, which says I have to look at not only the traditional things, but I now also have to start to look at how do my policies and procedures really tie into this. In most organizations, that creates a big hole because people pick up what is going on from an activity standpoint, but you don't really pick up, do they implement all the policies that they should? Are those policies in conflict with one another, really? Are some of those policies even illegal? How does that all relate to compliance requirements? So, there are a lot of things that are built into there that we say are the next evolution. They really get into the IBPM side with collaboration, with simulation, with performance, predictive performance management, and that type of thing. So that's all embedded in the as is in the to be, the solution build, which is as things start to roll into the IT, how does that really work? And we're now even starting to look at not rolling a lot into IT with low code or no code types of products that are out there right now. That's really the next wave of what's coming up. And then how do you get into deployment and control that deployment so you don't have, so you have the least probability of failure possible, the highest probability of success. And there are different ways that you can do that, and they're all built into that section. So as you can see, we go through there and we look at different things that we know work because of the projects that we've worked on, and like I say, warnings of what not to do because of things that we found out, landmines that we found. But some practical advice that, and these things are layered through everything, and it's stay out of the big battles. You need to have something that will help you avoid the problems so that you can essentially re-engineer them out of your development process before you actually have to deal with them. One of the big problems that we find is companies are not flexible and they're not creative. And so try to infuse that into the projects. And again, these things are infused throughout the hints. Don't be afraid to ask for help. And this is a big thing. Learn how to properly interview business managers and staff. I go into company after company where they're really turned off because the IT guys come in to say, well, what are your requirements? And this is still at BPM. And instead of looking at how the business works, well, what are the requirements? And then they talk IT to these guys. I'm here to tell you, there's no business manager that really cares whether you're using IBM's BPM product or you're using TIBCO or you're using whatever. They don't care. They have business needs, and you need to understand that you talk to them differently. And when you're talking to different business organizations, you need to do some background on what that's about so that you're talking to them in terms that they understand. What are the constraints? What are the capabilities? Constraints are more important than anything else. And being open to new ideas. And the seventh rule really deals with respect, which, a lot of people, well, if I didn't find it, it can't be. Everybody can find problems. Everyone can have ideas. How do you then encourage those ideas to come out through the interviews, through everything that you're doing? These hints, these practical advice rules are peppered throughout the hints, and they're a foundation belief that we have in how we want to move forward. Then, I would like to, urge everybody to buy both Jim's book and my book. That's the only blatant sales pitch you're going to get. But I think that, the bottom line is that today, with the complexity that is driving in, I talked to a lot of different companies. They said, we're just getting started. Talk to different companies that are moving to different BPMS tools. Companies are in a lot of different stages, in a lot of different states. And one of the things that Jim's book, in my opinion, helps you do is to look into the future and to pull that all together so that you have a coherent, cohesive way of looking at the future and where you're going. And then with the hints and the practical advice on how to actually succeed in building these things and break that 70% failure barrier, get it down to the 10% or less that it needs to be. Putting together the approach and the standardization and the concepts that we talk about in the Transformation Field Guide. So between the two of them, this is where Jim was talking about, I believe that we fit together, is looking at the future, putting that future direction in place, and then building the applications, building the solutions that you need in order to move into that future. With that, I'd like to turn it over for questions for either Jim or myself. And Courtney, if you'd be so good as to read any questions that may come in.
Absolutely.
Don't be shy. Ask questions, please.
All right. Someone asked, and I believe this was okay, so question to Dan, when will the book be available?
By the end of this week, it will be out on Amazon.
All right. And then there's a question about a link to the blog, which I believe was for Jim.
Yeah. If you look up Jim Sinor, S-I-N-U-R, on Google, my blog will pop up as the #2 hit or the #3 hit. But if you want me to give you the URL, I will do that. Just give me a second.
Is that on your slide, Jim? We can go back to your slide.
Yeah, I think it was on that. But it's jimsinor.blogspot.com. And Jim Sinor is one word.
Other questions? You have a chance to ask Jim. Me, you can ask anytime, but you have a chance to talk to Jim Sinor, which is a rare opportunity. So please take advantage of that.
Yeah, before they lock me away in a crypt, huh?
In the padded room next to mine.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, while you're thinking of additional questions, I'll give you a couple of ABPMP announcements, and that is, first of all, we're going to skip the July webinars, give everybody a chance for a little vacation time, but we'll be back in August. And if anybody would have any topics that they would like to make sure that we cover in the second half of the year, please send them in, and we'll be happy to find people to address them properly. And I'd also like to urge everyone to go out to the ABPMP website. We now have, over a dozen, probably at least 16 different webinars on different topics that you might find interesting and helpful. Any other questions for Jim or myself?
I have not got, I just got one. A question to Dan. I have the BPM CDOK and I am new to BPM. Is reading the book enough for the certification, or do you recommend courses?
The CBPA, Certified Business Process Associate, is based on the CBOC. So that's the first level certification. The second level certification is the business architect level, which is the Certified Business Process Professional. And that we have a course that you can sign up for. We're going to try to put the course out virtually so that people can, we're trying to emulate the, the big institutions, the universities, with their online courses. So we want to put this one, essentially have it as an online course to see how it goes. And that'll be the prep for the CBPP exam. So look for that. It's going to be coming out sometime this summer as far as starting it, and it'll run 1 or 2 evenings a week for an hour and a half a session, and that'll run until probably Thanksgiving.
All right. We have a question for Jim. What was it like collaborating with Peter Finger on your book?
Well, Peter is quite a visionary, and a lot of the collaboration that we did was, how much should we interject cognitive computing and AI into the book? So we spent a lot of time talking about that, and that was from a content perspective. Also, Peter is a renowned in that particular area as well as BPM. But he's also a publisher, so he runs MK Press, and working with him to taking me through the bumps in the road on self-publishing was quite good. I couldn't have done it without him. So there were 2 levels, one on content and one was getting the content to you.
Right. A comment from one of our attendees. That they just bought both of Jim's books on Amazon and are waiting for Dan's. Found that the subject of all of them very interesting.
Good.
And then a comment, Dan, I believe for you, or a question from one of our European participants. One of the big issues is a non-comprehensive, full understanding of what BPM will be in 2020, whether it's management or technology solutions. We know what we're talking about, but questions are, is business transformation as the next version of CBOC possibly emerge with process transformation with the enterprise process management chapters? Will a new chapter inside of the new CBOC version 4 be available? I don't know if if you're able to address any of that.
Well, let me do it 2 ways here. Let me address what all those subtopics I think I can remember, and then if I forget some, whoever wrote that, please keep me honest and send, okay, well, how about X that you forgot about? First of all, version 4 of the CBOC is going to be different than version 3. Right now, 3.1 is coming out. 3.1 updates a couple things and extends a couple things that we have in the book, recognizing that, you know, every few months the whole world changes in BPM. Version 4 is also going to align to the Certified Business Process Leader, which will be the highest level certification. And that essentially says, what do I need in order to transform an entire company? And so that's really kind of the level that will be at. The CBOC will include, at that point, version 4, will include the extra information that we need for that new certification. It will have an update that deals with different concepts like what is really happening when you move to a digital enterprise. One of the things that we know as far as the evolution in 2012 is concerned is we're going to have to tear down the silos. We're going to have to tear down the barriers, and we're going to have to look at collaboration differently. Today we look at the business side, we look at the IT side. Okay, that's two of the sides. We also have to look at change management. We also have to include in there business architecture. And then, of course, you have the data architecture and different things that come into it, too. We need to start to look at those things as one continuum, one whole, that we apply the different skills at different points in order to accomplish certain objectives that we then pass on to the next point until we start to move forward in a different way, a more collaborative way. But the other thing that is going to happen, and I believe that it'll happen by 2012, but I may be a year or two off, and that's there's going to be a whole evolution, I believe, in business. And that whole evolution right now is being stifled by one major constraint, and that's called legacy. The fact is, the technology that we have today and the stuff that's coming out is just Star Wars. It's wonderful stuff. We can do things now that, you know, when I was younger in IT, and I'm sure Jim will bear it out, we just dreamed about. We never thought it would happen, but it's here today. We never thought we could generate computer applications. We thought people would always have to write them. Well, now that's no longer true, and now with low code or really no code that some of these vendors are getting into, we're starting to see another shift. And how IT is going to be integrated into this new shift is yet to be determined, because when we don't have much coding to do, it changes the whole nature of the business and IT relationship. When you start to look at artificial intelligence, when you start to look at all these things are either on the horizon or getting closer to us, we now need to look at, from a strategic standpoint, what BPM is really going to be, because it's going to be, just as IT is going to be the foundation of every company, because no company will be able to exist without IT support. When you look at it that way, you now have to say, okay, now, how do we want this company to change, and how do we want it to morph as time goes on? And that's BPM, and whatever BPM, I call BPMS enabled BPM. What's that going to do? And what's the foundation? Today, I would submit that the companies have a very difficult time moving into the digital transformation world and digital computing, because it's not about IT. It's about business strategy, that it's enabled by certain IT capabilities. And that enablement, sitting right in the middle there between strategy and IT, is BPM. It's the business. So there has to be, by 2012, there needs to be a morphing where all this starts to be rethought and come together in a different way. Now, I don't know if I answered that entire question or I just rambled on to, putting everybody to sleep. But please, if I didn't answer your question adequately, let me know, and I'll be happy to give it another try.
All right. A follow-up to that particular question was, in Brazil, for example, we know that there are some problems with ABPMP with this innovation scenario. Is it still, are we still under the assumption that it is a local political problem?
I'm not sure. Could you read? I'm not sure what he's asking me.
Okay. The question answer, I would suggest that you contact Dan directly with that question.
My email address is on the screen, and please, I'd be happy to. I apologize that I'm not exactly sure what you're asking me for, but I do want to answer you. So please send it to my email address, and I'll be happy to answer that, or call me directly if you'd like to talk. Not trying to get out of the answer, I just need to understand the question.
Absolutely. And I know that we are getting close to our hour. I do have one other question regarding BPM from an SAP consultant who found BPM very interesting and are changing their career. Apart from learning BPM itself, where do you learn the business practices in order to recommend what process should be optimized and whether or not that comes from the projects themselves?
Jim, you want to take a hit at it?
I'd like to take a shot at that. It's the same strategy that you use to figure out what you want to digitize. So if you break up your portfolio of business function and business activity and work activity into a quadrant, and figure on the x-axis it's differentiation, and on the other axis mission control. So if it's highly differentiating and it's highly mission critical, that should be your first area of focus once you've gone through a more mundane experience level. So, you've got to get good at some of the skills and get good at the technology the first time through, so I wouldn't bite off one of those differentiating mission critical ones right away. But you could take a piece of it. Or you could take something that's less mission critical but very differentiating. Start there and determine which parts are process oriented. And there's different kinds of process styles. There are process styles for highly repeatable automated work that could be straight through processing with rules. But there's also work that's highly collaborative, emergent, and you share a lot of emerging and dynamic content like video and living content. Because BPM encompasses all of those capabilities to manage work, you may have to have different kinds of platforms to do it. So over the long haul, BPM will become a key crucial piece to the digital business platform, but there will be other aspects of collaboration and social collaboration, living content that is going to happen more on what today you would call more the fashionista end of computing, will become more important and will become part of process. So process implies, in the old days, very repeatable standard production. Tomorrow BPM is going to include all kinds of different kinds of work. And in the old days, that was 20% of what goes on in a company. In the digital age of 2020, It'll be more like 80% of the work that goes on because processes won't be as rigid. I hope that helped.
Great, great. Any other questions?
I have not received any others, no.
Okay, well, Jim, we are running out of our hour here. Would you, anything else that you'd like to make sure that you note?
Yeah, I want to close with a couple of things. One is my book was dedicated to my late son who worked at Disney on Frozen and Wreck-It Ralph and Big Hero 6, and I was proud that he taught me how to be creative. And the other thing is I would be retired right now if it wasn't for this exciting digital age. I just can't stand on the sidelines. There's so much excitement and so many brilliant case studies that are coming out from companies. We are just starting to see it happen. It's a trickle, and eventually it'll become a big stream of amazing application of technology. You'll see man and machine in a different collaboration method than you've ever seen before. It's going to be exciting and somewhat scary.
And dovetailing to that is we haven't seen anything yet. The people like Jim and myself, us old timers, we've lived through it essentially from the beginning, and that's why we're so amazed at the types of things that are available now. And frankly, younger people are just taking as just the way it is. They're taking it for granted. The technologies, the things that are available, the way things are working right now is a very interesting time. And the thing that I would urge everyone is to always have an open mind, because the way that things have been done in the past have been built on the capabilities of the past. And the capabilities that we're seeing emerge right now, I'm seeing a lot of resistance to how those things can be adapted and those things can be used. And that resistance is going to kill companies. Where we find people who are open, where we find executives are willing to invest in changing the fundamental infrastructure of how the company operates, those are the places that are going to succeed. And I was being interviewed earlier today by PEX. And one of the things that I mentioned was businesses today are like aircraft carriers. If you want to turn left or right, you have to plan it about 2 miles ahead because it takes that long to turn. The smaller, nimble companies, the Ubers of the world, are like little bitty rafts or little boats that speed around and make changes on every 3 feet that they want to turn in. The big companies have to be able to match that type of agility. They have to be able to react and to respond the way that these upstart companies are doing, leveraging the technologies that a lot of the big companies know exists but are somewhat ignoring because of the investment that it takes, both in not only in terms of the technology, but in terms of the change to their business and the way that they operate that business. We are at an exciting time, and I agree with Jim completely. You guys are going to live through a period that the world has never seen before, and it's really great. It's exciting. It's invigorating. So, with that, Jim, any final words?
I'm done. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you all for joining us. We appreciate your time and patience. And hopefully that we've given you some food for thought and some information in the form of our books that will prove to be helpful. Thank you, and we'll end the webinar now.
Ciao.